Alright, students, in this video we are going to talk about the action potential and its transmission from one part of the neuron to the another part. For that, I would like to draw the neuron first, a general structure of the neuron. So this is the cell body of the neuron, and that is the axonic hillock. So these are the dendrites, and that is an axon, and these are the axonic terminals. Right, so if we focus on this small part, which is axon hillock, the action potential always starts at the axonic hillock, where the change in the charges happen. We know that the cell membrane or the membrane of the neuron cell is not permeable to the charges, and it is always positively charged from the outside and negatively charged inside, and this is minus 70 millivolts, the resting membrane potential, when there is no action potential going on. This is because there is a higher concentration of sodium ions outside and higher concentration of potassium ions inside. Sodium ions tries to move in, cannot go in because the membrane is not permeable. Potassium ions tries to move out, cannot move out because this membrane is impermeable, and the sodium potassium pump is maintaining this difference of minus 70 millivolts in the amount of the charges outside and inside of the neuron cell membrane. Now imagine a graded potential which is greater than the threshold reaches to the action hillock at this point, which changes the polarity of the membrane. It reverses the polarity at this point, right? So I just mark here graded potential reaches here, which is greater than threshold. Okay, so graded potential greater than threshold reaches here and changes the polarity of the membrane. So this becomes positively charged here and negatively charged outside. So what happens at this point? There are sodium gates present. So this change and the reversal in the polarity of the membrane results into opening of the sodium potassium channel. Remember, it was closed initially, so it results into the opening of the sodium potassium channels. And what happens, sodium channel, it results into the opening of the sodium channels, and what happens that these sodium ions, which are higher in concentration outside, rush inwards right. So the concentration of the sodium increases inside, and basically the positive charges are increasing inside, so that positive charge is shifted towards the next part of the membrane, and hence the next part of the membrane, this one. So this is the part 1, part 2. So that's the part 1, that's the part 2, right? So that positive charge is moved towards the next part, and then the positive charge, when it reaches to the voltage gated potassium ion channels, it results into the opening of potassium ions. Okay, so the potassium ions, which were in the higher concentrations already within the cell, say they start moving, rushing out, right? So the potassium ions goes backwards, outwards, hence restoring the polarity of the membrane again towards the negative and positive outside. So this is called the repolarization, right? And then finally, when that action potential is being passed from this point. So these two gates are shut. By a specific protein that is called the ball and chain protein, or this is a ball and chain mechanism. It's like a chain of a protein with a ball attached to it, and that blocks these channels when this polarity is restored due to the movement of the potassium ions and sodium ions with the help of sodium potassium pump. So this mechanism, after some time, when this all the polarity is restored, these sodium and potassium gates are shut again, and no further movement of the sodium and potassium ion across the membrane happens, and the sodium potassium pump moves 3 sodiums outside and 2 potassiums inside to restore resting membrane potential. Now if we see all of this in the diagram, in a graph where we plot time on x-axis and voltage on y-axis, so we see that initially that cell membrane was at resting membrane potential, and that was minus 70 millivolts. Then a graded potential reached to the threshold potential, and then action potential started, and the membrane was depolarized, right? So this is the point. So this is the point where the sodium channels open and allow the movement of the sodium ions inside the neuron membrane, and results into the reversal of the membrane potential, and this is called depolarization. Once it reaches at the peak, at this point all of that nerve impulse has been moved to the end of the axonic terminals and have been passed on to the next adjacent neuron. So the need for the depolarization ends. So what happens at this point, sodium channels open and potassium channels open and sodium channels close, so which results into the movement of the sodium ions inside the cell, outside of the cell. The opening of the sodium channels results into the movement and diffusion of the excessive potassium ions out of the neuron cells, resulting into the restoration of the membrane potential to the negative inside, and this reaches to the resting membrane potential, and at this point what happens, that potassium channels also closes and sodium channels remain closed, and then resting membrane potential is restored. And from this point, sodium potassium pump starts working and shifts 3 sodium ions out of the cell and moves 2 potassium ions inside the cell to restore the resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts. So basically what is happening in terms of the conduction of the nerve impulse, so this is a basic neuron. The action hillock first becomes positive while the rest of the neuron is all negative. So this is the initiation of the action potential. This action potential is then shifted towards the next section, which becomes positive, and the previous section restores its resting membrane potential by the help of the same mechanism which I just have explained. and then later this change in the membrane potential is shifted to the next section in the neuron that becomes positive, while the previous two sections restores their membrane potential to the negative, and this way that action potential moves from one end to the end to the other end. Hope you like this lecture, and if you need any explanation or clarification regarding all these mechanisms, you can drop a comment.